So, um, welcome again. And we always, in this course, we will begin everything by invoking the Divine Mother with our particular, very specific greeting that is part of this tradition, which is Shri Matre Namaha. And what that means is Shri is auspiciousness, Matre means mother, and Namaha is an invocation to the Divine Mother to be here in our presence. So before we get into the specifics of the path of the Mahavidyas, I'm going to give you a little primer on some of the aspects of Hinduism, because this has so many different aspects in this whole path. There are so many different nuances that we are going to talk about, that if you're not familiar with some of the basics, some of the foundational issues, then it can get complicated. So many of you may be already very familiar with a lot of this, and I apologize for the redundancy if that is the case. But if you're not familiar with some of these issues, I think it's worthwhile to take a few steps back and talk about some of these issues. So, unlike all the other or most of the other faiths in the world religions, Hinduism is strictly not a religion, and it's called Sanatana Dharma, which means it is a way of life. It is a way of living. It's a way of being. It's a way of understanding our lives and ourselves through a particular lens. And so this way of life is based on a few underlying principles. So the first principle of this is that of unity of life. So what that means is that all of life, everything in creation, these are everything that we can see, everything that we can't see, everything is a manifestation of the one. So it is the one becoming many. So the diversity in the unity is really the foundational aspect of Hinduism. And so based on this, then it goes on to say really talk about the other principles, that it is indeed possible to live harmoniously in the world. It's possible to fulfill all of our desires in a very harmonious way. And very importantly, one of the principles that defines Hinduism is that life and death, these occur in cycles, and that life and death are really two sides of the same coin. So death is not a finality, and life always comes with the guarantee of death. And the other very important principle that is part of this foundational structure is that all of our actions have consequences. And we know this, of course, from living our lives, that everything we do will have a consequence. But what Hinduism teaches us is that some of these consequences will be known to us. But most of the consequences of what we do are really unfathomable. They cannot be known because they don't occur always in ways that are obvious to us. And there is that temporal effect of doing something, or the cause and the effect is not always known. The other important aspect of Hinduism is that there isn't a single prophet or a single book that all of these principles are based on. So, and here is where actually it becomes very interesting, because the scriptures on which Hinduism is based on are very diverse. And there are two broad categories of these scriptures. The first one is called Veda. There are 4 Vedas, and Veda literally means knowledge. So these scriptures are the oldest in the world, and actually nobody really knows the exact dating of these scriptures. And it's thought to be approximately 1200 to 1500 before Christ. And they are considered to be actually direct perceptions of reality by these extremely evolved seers or sages. So these Vedas are called in Sanskrit Shruti, and Shruti means heard. So these, voluminous scriptures are thought to have been directly heard by these seers, by listening to what is going on in reality. And these Vedas are actually manuals, they're practical manuals on how to live life and what kind of rituals to do, why to do those rituals, what is the point of doing these kinds of rituals. And there are very specific procedures for rites of passage in life. And this is not just for individual living, but also for social and communal growth, for growth of the society, and for evolving as a species. So they're very, very detailed manuals of these kinds of procedures, the Vedas. Now, the other group of texts in Hinduism are called the Agamas. And some of these Agamas are Vedic in dating, and some of them are later in origin. And in the way they differ a little bit from the Vedas is that nobody really knows, whether they're also thought to be perceptions of reality directly heard by these sages. But sometimes these Agamas are thought to have, passed down directly by particular deities themselves. So they are very, they're very revered because, for instance, Shiva is said to have directly spoken to, whoever, sometimes to Shakti, sometimes to a disciple, and have passed on this knowledge directly, and then that knowledge is then passed on down the lineage. There is a third category of texts in Hinduism, and those are called the Tantras. And unlike the Vedas, which, as I said, are considered Shruti or directly heard by listening to reality, these Tantras are called Smriti, or actually, which literally means remembered or remembering. So there are 92 Tantras in general, and they are classified in various ways. Some of them are entirely non-dual, such as those that we study in Kashmir Shaivism, for instance. Some of them are dual and non-dual, and then there are some which are entirely dualistic. And I'll explain what non-duality and duality and all of these things mean. And these tantras are also classified in a different way, and that is according to the deities that the highest truth or the highest ideal is assigned to. So whatever this highest ideal is, the supreme reality is, we can assign that to a particular deity, and then that deity becomes the form or the representation of that highest reality. And so the tantras can be divided that way as well. So as soon as we talk about deities, now we need to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about, what is up with all these deities in Hinduism. So in general, there are 4 streams in Hinduism based on the central deity or the central figure. So 2 of these are Vishnu and Shiva. So for that, I need to back up once again and talk about the Trinity in Hinduism. So in the Trinity, some of you are familiar, of course, with the Trinity in Christianity, for instance. That's a little bit different than the Trinity in Hinduism. In Hinduism, the Trinity is the creator, or Brahma, the sustainer, who is Vishnu, and the destroyer, who is Shiva. So these are all male deities, and of course they all have their feminine counterparts, which allow them to do their job, so to speak. So whether it is the creation of this moment and its sustenance, as well as its destruction to make way for the next moment, or for all the things that are going on in our lives, and as you know, as in creation as a whole, everything depends on these three aspects, right? Even our physiological processes, our cells need to be created, they need to be sustained for a certain time, and then the cells die. So everything has these three phases. So, and then we look at these common kinds of forces, and then we assign those forces to particular deities, and so they become the face of that function. So then there is Brahma, there is Vishnu, and then there is Shiva. So for various reasons in mythology, in Hinduism, Brahma doesn't really have worship. So we don't really worship Brahma as much. In all of India, there are just probably half a dozen Brahma temples, and they are just really more for archaeological interest, rather than the thousands and thousands of temples for Vishnu and Shiva, where there are daily rituals and daily worship that goes on. And there's one story in Hindu mythology where there is this sage Brigu, who is very haughty, very angry, and easily annoyed sage, and he goes to visit these three deities. So one thing to remember in these kinds of stories is that these deities live in their particular particular worlds. So Vishnu, for instance, lives in Vishnu Loka, or where very few people have access to go there in their bodily forms. And then Shiva is said to live high on the mountaintops, covered in snow, because he's an ascetic, he's a yogi, and is pretty detached from the world. And so these are just some of the mythological kind of depictions of these deities. And Brahma lives in his own world, or his own created space, called Brahmaloka. And so this sage Brigu, in some undated era, goes to visit these three deities. And when he goes to see Vishnu, for instance, he sees that he's distracted with his wife Lakshmi, and he curses him and says, well, you are going to have to go to earth as an avatar and do X, Y, and Z in order to come back. And so Vishnu is cursed, and he has to come down to the earth and live out that curse. And similarly, he curses Shiva to do something else. And then when he visits Brahma, he's completely ignored, and he doesn't like that, and gets really pissed off and curses him, and this very potent curse, and says, you'll never be worshipped on earth. And so that's the story for not worshiping Brahma as much on on earth. So essentially, then we are left with Vishnu and Shiva as these streams from which whole traditions arise of Vaishnavism, those that follow Lord Vishnu, and Shaivism, those that follow Lord Shiva. So entire streams of teachings and lifestyles and philosophies are built around these deities, these central deities of Hinduism, so which are Vishnu and Shiva. So the third stream in Hinduism, it centers around Shakti. So Shakti is the divine feminine, and she is considered the supreme power who actually gives the powers to the Trinity. So she is the one from whom Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva arise in that particular stream of Shaktism. So she is considered the fundamental creative force of the universe, and so she is worshipped as the supreme ideal. And in the fourth stream, so I remember I was telling you there are four streams. So there's Vishnu, there's Shiva, and there's Shakti. And in the fourth stream, which is called Smarta, 6 deities are simultaneously worshipped. So Vishnu, Shiva, Shakti, and then there's Surya, the sun god, and then the elephant god, the elephant-headed god, Ganesha, whom you see here, right in the center, and Skanda, or Kumara, who is both Ganesha and Skanda are considered to be the sons of Shiva and Shakti, which I will get to. So all 6 of these deities are worshipped together in this particular stream of Hinduism called Smarta. So there you have those 4 streams. Now, each stream, as I was saying earlier, consists of these extensive teachings, and importantly, each of them contains these voluminous mythological stories called the Puranas. And so the Puranas are a bit like, the parables, where, each of these stories in the Puranas, they are meant to open us to a particular kind of teaching or philosophy that may be too dense if it's not in the form of a story that we can relate to. And so all of these streams have these Puranas, they have their traditions, they have their practices, and they have their views. So in each of these streams then, that central deity is considered to be the supreme being. And all the other figures, all the other deities become secondary to that central figure. So if we talk about Shaivism, where Shiva is the supreme deity, then Vishnu is actually his subordinate. But then if you look at Vaishnavism, then Vishnu is the supreme deity, and then Shiva is the subordinate. And if you look at Shaktism, both of them are Shakti's subordinate. So what is so interesting in Hinduism is that all of these contradictions can exist simultaneously. So none of this actually contradicts, any view. So a single person can have this extreme love for Vishnu and have this extreme love for Shakti and have no conflict about it, because they're both manifestations of the same supreme being. So when we are talking about supreme being, then what is that? I mean, what are we actually referring to? And this is where this whole the whole philosophy and the understanding of non-duality comes in. So in the Vedic traditions, the supreme being is called Brahman. And this is very important. I'm a stickler for Sanskrit pronunciations, as some of you on this call know. So Brahman is very different than the word Brahmin or the word Brahman or Brahman, both of which refer to actually a particular class of people in society. So we don't want to get those confused. So Brahman, that's the way to pronounce that word, is the supreme being. And we'll be talking about Brahmins later in a later class, because it's very important to understand that. But Brahman is the absolute non-dual reality. So non-dual simply means lack of duality. So in Sanskrit, the word is Advaita. A is the negative for whatever the word is in front of it. Dvaita means two, and Advaita means not two. So that means the lack of duality means, the lack of this division between this and that, black and white, black and white, good and evil, me and not me, us, not us. So these kinds of fissures or these kinds of divisions that are created in our worlds and in our minds, they all arise from this sense of duality, of this versus that. And anything that divides creation into discrete pieces is duality. So in one way, I mean, could you say this is diversity? Yes, you could call it diversity, but the word diversity has more of a connotation of loving acceptance. Well, we are all diverse, but but that's acceptable. But duality actually is not diversity in that it causes friction, it causes suffering. And so how that happens is what we're going to examine in this course, and how to actually overcome that and fix our views is what we are going to examine quite a bit on this journey. But the fundamental problem is that duality is based in a sense of separateness, of being separate from everybody else, from the world, from everybody else. So this individuality is something that is inbuilt in us, something that is learned from a very young age. And then even within ourselves, we have these kinds of fissures in terms of our personalities, our dreams, and our aspirations. There are parts that we like about ourselves. There are parts that we dislike about ourselves, that we'd rather forget, rather just bury, not think about it, and pretend that they don't exist, right? So that also comes from that innate that sense of duality, of separateness, because that is that fissuring, or that divisiveness of good and evil, or acceptable and not acceptable. So so duality is actually the problem, the problem, or the fundamental problem with duality is that it's not how the world is. It's a problem of our vision. So when I say vision, it's not the external sense of looking through the eyes and then what we take in and what's processed in the brain, but it's actually our inner vision, our inner sense. That's what I mean by vision. And that fissured kind of, that wrong vision, that wrong way of looking at ourselves and the world is a case of mistaken identity. So what does that mean? What am I talking about, in terms of mistaken identity? So identity is what we take ourselves to be. Okay, so let's now do this exercise. Okay, so we actually kind of get a little practice in this form of inquiry and contemplation. So just for a moment, sit back and close your eyes. And make sure you're sitting comfortably. And make sure your spine is erect. And take a couple deep breaths. Just take one deep breath and exhale. And now just listen to this question. Who are you? When I ask this question, who are you? Just pay attention to that sense of what you think you are. So if you have been on the spiritual path long enough, there might be some ideas that come up, well, I am the supreme being. But that is a thought. Is that really how you feel? That is the question. So when we ask ourselves, who am I? What am I? What is this thing that I call me? What comes up when you ask this question? So ordinarily what happens is that as soon as we ask this question of ourselves, or somebody else asks us this question, we start describing our experience of who we are, which is based on taking ourselves to be this body mind. This person who is inhabiting this body, and the body is being animated by the mind. But importantly, we think that who we are is the story of our lives, the experiences we've had, the roles we play, our personalities, what we like and what we don't like, our history, and so on and so forth. And if you're closing your eyes, you can keep your eyes closed if that's comfortable, or you can open them now. So in reality, actually, what we are is eternal bliss consciousness. So think about that for a second. Eternal, which means undying, unborn, always here, eternal, bliss. And when we talk about bliss, we can think of being slap happy all the time, for instance. But that's not what we are referring to here as bliss. So bliss here means simply that understanding of being whole and being complete and being fulfilled all the time. So just absolute contentment is more the definition of bliss in this case. And consciousness, so eternal bliss consciousness. So consciousness, we understand consciousness as being something that, I'm conscious, I'm not asleep right now, so I'm conscious, or I'm not in a coma right now, I'm conscious. And that's sentience. But actually, consciousness here refers to the ground of being from which everything arises. So who we are is this eternal bliss consciousness, which in Sanskrit is called Sat Chit Ananda. And when we hear this, for whatever reason, at whatever points in our journey, we hear that, wait, I am eternal bliss consciousness. Why don't I feel that way? Why don't I experience this? And that is because of this case of mistaken identity. It's because we are taking ourselves to be the body mind with our, with being married to our story and so on and so forth, that we are unable to see who we really are. So, so that is the fundamental problem. Okay. So with that background now, then let's see. So where do the Mahavidyas, fit to all of this? Let's examine this path that we are about to tread over the next few weeks. So the path of the Mahavidyas is the path of the divine feminine, or Shakti. So, just to give you a little bit of a historical background of the origins of the Mahavidyas. So remember, I was telling you earlier that each stream in Hinduism comes with its own teachings and, these extensive story-like teachings called the Puranas. So the Mahavidyas first appear in some of these Puranas, specifically the Mahabhagavata Purana and the Brihadharma Purana, which are 14th century texts, or they are particular texts in that stream of Shaktism. So in one, story, what is the story of the origin of the Mahavidyas? So in one story, so I was telling you earlier that there is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, right? So in some undescribable time, right, way before any of us have been alive, way before what we know creation to be right now, in that era, in that time, Brahma and Vishnu were married. So not to each other. Brahma is married to Saraswati, goddess Saraswati. And why is that? I mean, think about that. Brahma is the creator. So in order to create, you need knowledge, right? And Saraswati embodies knowledge. So when we say he's married to Saraswati, it's not like the usual human relationship here. It means that she is his power to create. Similarly, Vishnu's Shakti, or his power to sustain, is the goddess Lakshmi. And why is that? Because in order to sustain anything, you need abundance, you need wealth, and you need the resources. So she is that goddess that provides those kinds of things. So so Vishnu Shakti then is this goddess Lakshmi. Shiva, on the other hand, he is a bachelor. This is in that time. So he's not interested in any of the stuff. He is this destroyer, but he is completely detached. He has no desire to be associated with the feminine. Okay, so now what happens is that when Shiva goes into meditation, he forgets to do his job, which is to destroy so that Brahma can create again and Vishnu can sustain it. So, and we think that might be a good thing, right? If nothing is destroyed, but actually life cannot be sustained without destruction. And we'll see a lot of this in the next class. So creation starts coming to a standstill when Shiva doesn't do his job. So Brahma and Vishnu and all the other deities, when they can't, figure out a solution to something, they go to Shakti. Now, Shakti is the divine mother. She is, like I was telling you earlier, she is the one that gives power to everybody else in this particular stream, right? In Shaktism. So when they go to her and say, well, please help us with this, and she says, fine, I will woo Shiva, and I'll have him do his job eventually. So she takes birth as this beautiful daughter of Daksha. Now, Daksha is one of the kings, and he's also a son of Brahma. So she takes birth as his daughter, and she, wins over the heart of Shiva. And in a very, it's beautifully described in the Puranas how she wins over Shiva's heart, and and they finally get married and they are together. But actually, Daksha, Sati's, and her name is Sati, as Shiva's wife. Daksha, her father, has no regard or respect for Shiva, because Shiva is sitting, in the mountains. He's, if you've seen a picture of Shiva, you see that he's covered in ashes and he's covered in snakes, and he hangs out with the downtrodden and the outcasts of society. And Daksha thinks that Sati is too good for him. But he is actually very pissed off with Sati too for having chosen Shiva over everybody else, when she could have chosen anybody else in the whole universe. So to be spiteful, he actually performs a huge ceremony, and he invites everybody else, right? This is like the Oscars, the who's who of this whole deity world. Everybody's invited to this ceremony except Shiva and Sati. So he deliberately doesn't invite them. And when Sati comes to hear that her father is doing this ceremony, she feels really bad. She's like, maybe he forgot, maybe it was an oversight. Come on, let's go. She calls Shiva and says, let's go to this ceremony at my dad's house. And he says, no, I'm not coming. And he tells her, you shouldn't go either. And so in this story, when Shiva tries to put down his foot and says, I don't want you to go, suddenly Sati, this gentle form, this epitome of sweetness and gentleness, her face turns dark, and suddenly Shiva looks in all these 10 directions. So there are 10 directions typically, right? So there are, in most of our, understanding, there are 10 important directions. So to his horror, these 10 goddesses leap out of Sati's body, and they are basically surrounding him in these 10 directions. And he looks at each one of these goddesses, and he is, he's shocked actually that these fierce goddesses are coming out of his gentle wife. And as Kali, she says to him, how dare you tell me what to do? And look around you. There is nowhere that I'm not. She says, I am all of creation. So you, including you are part of me. So that is the origin of these Mahavidyas in one of the stories. So Shakti is actually, she is linked like that to Shiva as his wife or his life force. But the Mahavidyas actually also appear in various tantras. So the Todala Tantra, for instance, the Mahanirvana Tantra, the Shakti Sangrama Tantra, many different tantras described these 10 goddesses. And the thing is, each of these texts actually describe the Mahavidyas a little bit differently than the other, and sometimes very differently from the other. So in some, these goddesses manifest on earth to destroy evil and to maintain, dharma, which we will talk about in a later class, what dharma is. In some, they are called to destroy demons particularly, and many scholars and practitioners have tried to make sense of this particular grouping of goddesses. What is so special about putting these 10 goddesses together? So it turns out that nothing actually fits so easily in terms of why they are grouped together. So for instance, we may think that because all these goddesses spring from Sati, Shiva's wife, they are all related to Shiva. But actually, we'll see as we go along that, for instance, Dhumavati, she has no sign of Shiva in her symbolism, in her iconography. And then the last of the Mahavidyas, Kamalatmika, actually, she is considered to be another form of the goddess Lakshmi. And Lakshmi, as I was saying earlier, is the wife of Vishnu. So it's not that, they are, all these goddesses are linked to Shiva, and that's why they are grouped like that, because it doesn't make sense. Now, they are also seen by some scholars as stages of consciousness or corresponding to the phases of the moon, and so many different ways of grouping these 10 goddesses, but nothing actually making a whole lot of sense. But one thing that is common in all of these writings, in all of these descriptions of the Mahavidyas, is how they are depicted. And you have all probably seen by now, is that these goddesses have one thing in common, and that they are fierce. So now this part is a very novel way of looking or depicting women. And a lot of scholars talk about this actually, because this contradiction to how women are or are expected to behave or were expected to behave is something that these Mahavidyas are very clear in their depictions. So they stand in total defiance to moral and social norms, and they're absolutely wild, and they have no care for concepts such as virginity or purity or subservience or weakness, all of these qualities which are attributed to good women. Right? We think of good women as having these kinds of qualities, but these goddesses have they stick their tongues out and say none of that, right? And in Indian traditions particularly, and those of you who are Indian will actually appreciate this, this is actually a shocking turn of events in the history of this the spiritual traditions in India. So why is that? Because the ideal woman in these Indian Hindu traditions is Sita. Okay, so Sita is the wife of Rama. So another story here, Rama is an avatar of Lord Vishnu, and he comes down to earth to fulfill a particular destiny, and that is to establish good over evil in that particular age. And Vishnu has many such avatars. 10 of these are the most famous. In fact, the 10 Mahavidyas in one particular way of describing are thought to relate to each of these 10 avatars, but even that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But in any case, Rama is an avatar of Lord Vishnu. And in that avatar, he is an embodiment of virtue, and he demonstrates the qualities of being the perfect king, the perfect son, the perfect brother, even the perfect enemy. And the perfect husband. And Sita is his virtuous wife, who's depicted as one who's completely, entirely obedient to him, to Rama, and to his family. And she's extremely subservient to her circumstances. She accepts all of his, even seemingly ridiculously unjust actions without question. She doesn't question him, even when, he sends her away, in a full-term pregnancy with his twins, because he is trying to uphold the virtue of being the perfect king. Now, for centuries, Sita has been the idealized woman in Indian traditions. Women are asked to be unquestioningly obedient to the men in their lives, not just their husbands. When they're born to their fathers, when they are married to their, husbands, and then, when they become mothers to their sons. So they are always asked to be in the subservient roles, right? And in the midst of this rhetoric, arise these 10 goddesses, the Mahavidyas, who are anything but obedient. And as unlike Sita as it can get. And as we will see, even the gentler of the Mahavidyas, such as Bhuvaneshwari, they have a fierce side to them. So let's understand, who these goddesses are. And for this, we have to have a different understanding of Shiva and Shakti. So this whole time I've been talking to you and telling you about Shiva like he's this deity who lives in the mountaintops and is covered with, snakes and ashes and has this quirky personality. But actually, we have to now shift gears and look at the tantric understanding of Shiva and Shakti. And that's what we will do for the rest of this course. So Shiva, the word Shiva literally means auspiciousness or purity. And Shakti, the word Shakti, literally means power, specifically creative power. So Shiva and Shakti, now forget about all the other deities and things I told you about. They'll become important as we go along to understand certain concepts. But Shiva now and Shakti together are this absolute non-dual reality that we were earlier calling Brahman. So here, Shiva and Shakti together are Brahman. They are inseparable. And how is that? And to think of Shiva and Shakti like water and wetness, or fire and heat. You just can't separate them, right? They are together. They're always one. So it is said that in the beginning, before creation, Shiva and Shakti rest together as a potential. So for our limited minds, this is a very difficult concept, right? It's like, what does that mean? So this potential is resting without movement. So it's just a potential. And the first movement in that potential is one of self-recognition or self-awareness. So it is that sense that is called I am. It's not I am this or that. It's just that sense of being, of knowing that I am. So in that movement of self-recognition, Shiva and Shakti become as if they are separate. So it's said that Shiva looks at himself as Shakti. So Shiva looking at himself is Shakti. So again, they can't be separated. In that, in that moment or in that instant of separation, creation begins. So when we talk about creation and the roles of Shiva and Shakti in this creation, Shiva is the transcendent as in he is the supreme awareness. And within this, creation begins as Shakti. So She is his power to create. So all of Shiva's powers are Shakti. So when that separation happens between Shiva and Shakti, the forces of creation are enumerated as 10 forces. And these 10 are the Mahavidyas. So what are these forces? Time, space, will, the desire for creation, the knowledge for creation, the action of creation itself, and so on. So all of these aspects of creation are Shakti's different forms. So the whole idea of creation in this understanding is that in this creative process, this divine, eternal, undying consciousness, which is expanded and limitless, becomes contracted to become the universe, to become nature and seasons, to become you, to become me. So the divine contracts itself to become everything. So this is a very important concept to understand. So essentially then, who we are is the divine in this contracted form, right? So unlike us women, mothers that give birth, and then the child becomes separate from me, Shakti gives birth to the entire universe, and she becomes the universe. So the non-dual one becomes contracted in separateness, in duality of me and the other. And there might be questions like, why would the divine do that, right? And in the tantric traditions, they say because Shiva and Shakti together, Shiva, Shakti, they can do that. It can do that. The divine can do that in its absolute freedom. It can do anything. And so that is the reason for this expanded consciousness to become contracted. So the true nature of who we are is this non-dual eternal self that we are going to call the self with a capital S. But what we take ourselves to be, which is this contracted, limited person in this body mind with the story and so on, this we will call the I self, because it centers around the I. But you can also call it the ego, which is what it's called in all of these non-dual Indian traditions. So we can also call it the separate self, because that's what it is. So the Mahavidyas then, they are these forces of creation, or these forms of Shakti that creates not just the universe, all that we see, but it also creates us, the small me, this person who is stuck in this duality of me versus not me. So they are the primordial creative forces of the macrocosm, which is like the time and space and so on, and also the microcosm, which is this limited person. So in this, the Mahavidyas are very much a part of the tantric path. So these are tantric goddesses. Now, non-duality in the tantric tradition it goes a little bit further than the other traditions, because it's an integration of the transcendent as well as the immanent. So it's not just about saying, well, I'm just going to go and I'm going to realize who I am, and that's it. And then I don't want to have anything to do with this world or with this body and with this mind and my family and so on, right? So it actually means that the non-dual understanding is to understand that who I am, is this unlimited, undying, unborn, eternal consciousness that is actually flowing through this body mind. So it's this body mind too is that. So nothing is excluded in this path of understanding or opening to non-duality in this path. So the universe with all its dualities are contained within me. So the good, the bad, the ugly, everything is divine. Nothing is excluded in this path, right? So there are no fissures in our personality where one part of me is okay and the other part isn't. So this kind of non-dual knowledge of reality is the highest form of knowledge. It's the highest form of understanding. And that's why they are called Mahavidya. Maha means great, Vidya means knowledge. This is why these goddesses are called the Mahavidyas, because they open us to the highest form of knowledge. And each Mahavidya actually conceals the totality of creation within her. And that's why each of them is called a Mahavidya. So what is the path of the Mahavidyas? So what are we going to do, over the next, 11 weeks? So for this, we have to understand the purpose of the spiritual path. So ultimately, the purpose of the spiritual path is to move from the I self, the limited self, to the self, which is the non-dual self, the great self with the capital S, right? So all non-dual paths have this common goal. So it's not about, and we'll talk a lot about the difference between self-improvement, where that's confined to the I self and trying to make the I self better, which is all fine. But that doesn't necessarily lead to this shift in identity from I self to self, from the ego to the self. So how the shift occurs from the I self or the ego to the self, how the shift in identity, the mistaken identity is removed and we come to see who we really are, that how defines the path, right? So the Mahavidyas, if you see, they occur in a particular sequence. So why is that? Why is there a sequence? And as I was saying earlier, not all scholars and not all texts actually describe these Mahavidyas in this particular sequence. So I have chosen in my book, and other scholars, these great scholars have chosen this particular sequence of goddesses in this sequence, because the shadow of one Mahavidya, the contraction of one Mahavidya gives rise to the next, and to the next, and to the next, and to the next. So what does that mean? So these Mahavidyas are unique. I was telling you how they are fierce and they break all norms in terms of what the feminine is. But there is one more thing that is actually very unique to them. And that is, unlike all the other kind of, goddesses that we see in Hinduism or elsewhere, where the goddess is actually an embodiment of light, right? She is pure, she's all great, she's all good. There is no place for darkness within those iconographies. For example, look behind me and you'll see this is Saraswati and this is Lakshmi on either side of the goddess Bhuvaneshwari. And you'll see that when you look at Lakshmi or Saraswati and their iconographies and their symbolism, they are absolute, beacons of light, right? But the Mahavidyas are not like that. They contain in them both the darkness and the light, because they're showing us that nothing excludes the divine. Everything has to be included, including our own shadows and our own, what we perceive as shortcomings must be embraced within us in order to arrive at that highest knowledge, or Mahavidya. So they actually, in this tradition, the shadow aspect of each Mahavidya is the one that makes us more and more identified as the ego, as the small self. anything that makes us identified in that contracted state, or makes us identified with that contracted state, is a shadow of the Mahavidya. Correspondingly, the light of the Mahavidya is the one that opens us to the self, to that absolute non-dual reality. So you can see that, because they are forces of creation, they necessarily form these contracted states. And they also hold in them the light to take us beyond that shadow into the light, which means that removing that mistaken identity. Okay, I hope that is making sense. So the fundamental principle of this path of the Mahavidyas is that the transcendent, this non-dual reality, can be realized through facets of creation, through our own limitations. So it's not like we need to ignore them and go chasing after something else. Our freedom lies in our bondage. And so that is the path that we are about to tread. So, and also, this non-duality is an experiential path. It's not a philosophical one. It's something that we need to experience again and again in different ways in order to arrive at this greater understanding. It can't be a philosophical one where we're just talking and nothing really happens. And then we don't really need to go off to a cave, meditate all day, and hope to realize non-duality, right? We don't do that in this path. We need not cut ourselves off from the world to know who we really are. So it's about being here in our very busy lives, in our very, very contracted states, and opening to the expanded non-dual understanding by traversing our own shadows. So it's actually a path about this whole path of the Mahavidyas is about embodying our deepest, darkest shadows, as well as the great light, all together simultaneously. So, and then it's not just about realizing the self, right? So this path actually has two different aspects to it. One is the upward journey of realizing the self. And then we'll see actually that upward journey goes up to, the seventh Mahavidya, which is Dhumavati. And then in the last three Mahavidyas, actually the journey is a return one, where we bring that transcendent understanding of self-knowledge back into the body. And so we embody that truth, and then we live that in the world. And we open again and again through our bodies. So this is a beautiful process where our bodies become vehicles for that highest form of knowledge. So very briefly to tell you, the Mahavidyas are encountered in the path of Sri Vidya Sadhana. And this is Sri Vidya is a particular path of the divine feminine, which is centered around the goddess Lalita Tripura Sundari. And we are going to study her. She's the third Mahavidya, and we are going to experience her through our practices. But Sri Vidya actually centers around Lalita, Sundari. And in that path, actually, we encounter the Mahavidyas in that path as these forces of creation emanating from Lalita or from Tripura Sundari. But what is so beautiful about the Mahavidyas is that they're not restricted to the Sri Vidya path. It doesn't matter what your path is, whether it's Advaita Vedanta or yoga or Tantra or not even in any of the Indian traditions. It doesn't matter, because we will encounter these issues in all paths. So essentially then, in this two-part journey, it's like, the whole, I'm sure many of you have heard of this Zen saying that, initially on this path in Zen Buddhism, you have, this practitioner looking at the mountains and seeing that they are mountains, and then there are trees, and there are rocks, and there are people. And then in the second stage of the journey, that practitioner sees, wait, the mountains are not mountains, the trees are not trees, everything is divine. And in the third stage, it's coming back and saying, well, the mountain is the mountain, the tree is the tree. But you see, something has changed in that perspective from the first part to the third part. Initially also, he or she thought that's a mountain. And now too, they are thinking that's a mountain. But something has changed where the mountain is no longer just a mountain. So that is very similar to this path that we're on, and in this path of the Mahavidyas. So, and very importantly, what is very fundamentally different in the path of the Mahavidyas is that these goddesses, in their iconographies, they show us that it is the path of breaking barriers. So what are these barriers? These are the cultural, social, moral, and spiritual conditioning that all of us kind of have, cling to, which does not help with that mistaken identity. All of these conditionings actually make that, mistaken identity very, very dense. And so it's about breaking those barriers and melting those barriers so that we open to this non-dual understanding. So although the Mahavidyas are, they are part of the Shakta Tantra, their path is actually much more holistic. And they have elements of Advaita Vedanta and yoga as well. So let's, and just so I can clarify these concepts, I'll talk briefly about Advaita Vedanta as well as yoga. So remember the 4 Vedas we talked about earlier, right in the beginning. The word Veda literally means knowledge. So as I was saying earlier, the Vedas are reservoirs of knowledge, right? And each Veda has 4 components consisting of the knowledge of mantras and rituals and procedures in the first 3 parts. The 4th or the last component of each Veda contains what are called the Upanishads, and which literally translates to sitting down near. So these are teachings that were passed on from teacher to student, where the student used to sit by the teacher and absorb everything that the teacher had to say and ask questions of the teacher. So it was a dialogue, that went on between the teacher and the student absorbed all this knowledge. So there are more than 200 Upanishads that we know of. Now, what's very interesting about these Upanishads is that they are called Vedanta. Veda means knowledge, Anta means end. So it's a very, very clever play of words because, of course, they occur at the end of the Vedas, and so they are the end of the Vedas, so Vedanta. But actually, it has a very deep esoteric meaning. It's the end of knowledge. So whatever knowledge we have been gaining, in the procedures and the mantras and so on, that is all discarded when you come to Vedanta. Because while all of that knowledge is actually gathering, objects, right, in the form of knowledge, you gather knowledge, the Upanishads or Vedanta is actually self-knowledge. It's about understanding the self who knows, or the self that is acquiring that knowledge, the self that is this non-dual Brahman or the non-dual reality. So Advaita Vedanta is the name given to a specific stream of Vedanta where, as I was saying earlier, Advaita means not two. So it's the non-dual stream of Vedanta that is called Advaita Vedanta, very, very much, attributed as having been established in India by this great sage called Shankaracharya. So Advaita Vedanta is this non-dual approach to reality and to realizing this non-duality. And it's a very systematic, very logical kind of a path that delves into self-knowledge, where two things are very important for understanding or for the self-knowledge to happen in Advaita Vedanta. One is discernment or discrimination. So discernment here, it actually refers to the ability to discern between the self and the objects that appear to the self. So here, the self is the one with the capital S. So the ability to discern between the self or reality and objects that appear to that is extremely important, because that is the discernment between subject and object. And we'll get to this very experientially as well. So the self that never changes, and all the objects, our stories, for instance, that make up our identity, these are things that come and go. So the ability to discern between those two, which is very subtle, is something that is very important to cultivate in Advaita Vedanta as well as in this path of the Mahavidyas. So the other qualities, the other quality that is required for self-knowledge in Advaita Vedanta is dispassion. So this non-attachment to, or non-clinging to our stories and or what we think makes up our mistaken identity. And this is also something that needs to be cultivated. So we'll discuss all of this in the course, so please don't feel like this is all too much. This is just a primer for the whole course. Now, yoga is the other path that, many of which elements are in this path of the Mahavidyas. And I'm sure many of you are much more familiar with yoga than all the other things we've been discussing. Some of us may think of yoga as a physical fitness kind of an activity, which it is in many ways, but it's not really about being bendy. As most of you already know, the word yoga comes from the root yuj, which means to join. And for our purpose, we can think of yoga as the joining or the integration of the transcendent, the self with the capital S, with the ego or the I self. That is that second part of the journey that's going to happen once we have realized the self. Now, there are quite a few well-known descriptions of, or compilations of the science of yoga. And amongst them all, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are very widely known. There are others, of course, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and others, but Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are very systematically compiled into these 8 limbs of yoga. And so whether it is Tantra, Yoga, or Vedanta, now self-knowledge, that highest knowledge, is the common goal. And in all of these paths, actually, our ability to understand the subtleties of self-knowledge requires that we cultivate that discernment. That is the fundamental thing in Advaita Vedanta. Now, having said all this, why should we seek self-knowledge? I mean, what is the purpose of that? Why can't we just not even think about this? So if we think really about ourselves and where all of us are going, all of us are seeking happiness. All of us are seeking permanent contentment. Ultimately, that is what drives us. And the only thing that can give us permanent contentment is self-knowledge. And why is that? Because the very act of seeking comes from feeling incomplete. And that sense of being incomplete is the result of this contraction by the divine. So it's the nature of creation that makes us into this contracted being, comes with the sense of lack, of being incomplete. Because inherently we all know, on some level or other, we all know that there's something greater that we are, that's our identity. But we can't really know that. We don't really know that. So we seek completion in all kinds of other ways, whether it is in wealth or in relationships or in our children or, in all kinds of activities in order to feel fulfilled. But that can never be, because no matter how much we are going to acquire, the fundamental problem is that one that of contraction, which is the very nature of creation. So the only way to obtain or to understand or to feel fulfilled permanently is to understand who we are, which is that self-knowledge. And when we come to the spiritual path, we are given the tools to feel better. And all of us come to the spiritual path to feel better in one way or the other. But very few paths actually give us the tools to face our shadows. These parts of ourselves, our pain and our fears, and to allow them to arise and to embrace them, right? Instead, we become very good at focusing entirely on the positive. I mean, we're told, right, in society to think positive, just be optimistic. And that's good. That's very good advice. But that doesn't really, take into account that fissures us, that breaks us into not wanting that darkness. And so we live in this mistaken notion that somehow, if we focus entirely on the light, that will automatically take care of all of our buried issues. But we have seen this, right? Many of us have seen this in spiritual communities where that is not the case. People can live in this teaching of the light all their lives and do these things. They act in ways that make no sense to us, whether it's about misbehaving with others or assaulting others, or the whole thing about for instance, spiritual teachers or people in places of power doing very, very, very lowly kinds of things with other people, right? And that shows us that just being in the presence of light is not enough to really embody that light. We have to actually embrace our shadows. And even renowned teachers actually come under the influence of their unexamined issues. And this is something that all of us see all the time. It doesn't matter how enlightened they have to face their shadows. So in this regard, the Mahavidyas are spectacularly unique. They don't allow for any of these kinds of misconceptions. And they force us to embody our greatest shadows and our light. And they force us to face our demons and to reconcile with them. So if you read about the Mahavidyas in the various texts, you'll see that there are many different ways to work with them. But here in this course, we are going to examine them very practically while being rooted in devotion and surrendering to each of them to allow them to lead us into the depths of our own being and to show us how to work with our issues. So whether it's yoga or tantra or Vedanta or any other spiritual path, we are actually asked to cultivate certain qualities. And these are called in yoga and in tantra, the yamas and the niyamas. And you have actually a sheet. You have this in the homework or in the lesson section of the 5 yamas and the 5 niyamas that are most well known in the yoga teachings. Now, the yamas and niyamas can be translated as moral codes or ethical codes, and these aren't new for any of us. This is true for every tradition. We are asked to cultivate these qualities. But when they are forced upon us, and when it becomes an external kind of a force upon us to say, when people say you have to be honest all the time, you don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you, and so on, when these are not arising from our own experience, then they we tend to rebel against them. Don't tell me what to do. That's our common human behavior. How do I know this? Because I have two teenagers, so I can't really tell them do something or don't do something without actually giving them tools to understand why they should be following those ethical codes. So it is actually on this path, because the way we're going to examine these 10 Mahavidyas is that the light of each Mahavidya is going to correspond to one of these yamas and niyamas. And the way we'll arrive at the light, at one of these yamas or niyamas, is going to be by examining the opposite quality of the shadow. And so we will arrive at the light by going deeply into our own shadows of those corresponding opposite qualities. So that's going to be the path of the Mahavidyas. So that's a lot of talking. So I'm going to now ask you to, if possible, go to the sheet you have on the opening mantras, and we'll chant them together. And so I want to speak a little bit about these mantras. These are 3 very simple mantras. They are invoking the goddess Shakti to be, to bless us with this highest knowledge. And as I was saying earlier, devotion is a big part of this path, and it does not have to look a particular way. You don't have to be devoted to any of these deities, but you have to be devoted to something. And it can be devotion to the self. It can be devotion to the truth. It can be devotion to the path itself. But we have to have love for what we are doing. Because if we don't have that, then the whole thing becomes very dry, and the opening isn't juicy and sweet. It's devotion and love for this path and for this wanting to open that gives us the fuel for practicing and for being open to what the goddess wants to show us. So these mantras are very simple. I chant them every day. These are my puja mantras. They are the ones that I do my prayers with. And each of these 3 of them, they're very simple 2-line mantras, but they have a lot of power in them. And the meanings in the sheet that you have. So as I'm chanting, you can follow along and chant with me. Namo Devyai Mahadevyai Shivayai Satatam Namaha. Namah Prakrityai Bhadrayai Niyata Pranatasmatam. Jayanti Mangala Kali Bhadrakali Kapalini Durga Kshama Shiva Dhatri Swaha Swadha Namostute. Sarva Mangala Mangalye Shive Sarvartha Sadhike Sharanye Trayambake Devi Narayani Namostute. So try to chant these mantras before you sit down for practice every day. And if you can't memorize it, that's fine, or just play it. Um, and you'll see the magic that occurs with these mantras. So there is another way of approaching the Mahavidyas. Traditionally, they are approached through specific mantras and the yantras, which are these sacred geometric forms. We will not be doing that in this course, and potentially we are going to do that in other courses. Here in this course, we are going to approach the Mahavidyas in a very practical way to discover their macrocosmic and their microcosmic presence in us. So, on the microcosmic level, these goddesses are our shadows and our light in our psyches. Okay, so they take the form of everything that's playing out within us. On the macrocosmic level, they represent forces of creation. So, what's so interesting is that the macrocosmic force of creation is the basis for the microcosmic manifestations of the shadow and the light. And that's what we will examine with each of these goddesses. So, we'll be actually working with both of these aspects with specific practices. We'll be working on the microcosmic aspects, we'll be working on the macrocosmic aspects, and that's a very holistic way of approaching these Mahavidyas. So we will be examining our shadows and how to open to light. And here we will be using, practices from the progressive paths. And to look at the fundamental forces of creation, we are going to rely on practices from the direct path. So let me talk briefly about these two types of paths. So progressive paths are the ones where we progress from one stage to another. So we start where we are and we say, I am this limited entity because that is my experience right now, but I need to get there in this future time where I'm going to know myself as the transcendent reality. So it is this movement, and in this movement, from here as this limited person to that as that unlimited divine consciousness, there are various steps. I'm going to have to purify my mind, I'm going to have to purify my body, and I'm going to have to purify my life and cultivate all these different qualities, and then I will know the self. So yoga and Tantra and Advaita Vedanta are all progressive paths because they occur in stages. We are asked to cultivate various things and then get into more and more advanced practices as we go along. The direct path, on the other hand, states that we are already the self, which is true, right? Doesn't matter whether we know it or not, we are already always this. So why don't we take a stand as who we really are and examine our direct experience of whatever is happening with the world, how we look at ourselves, our bodies, our minds. We were going to examine this not from the stand of this limited person, but we are going to take a stand as that transcendent self and examine all of our, all of the issues that we need to examine from that standpoint. So you see, the difference between the progressive and the direct paths is the stance. In the progressive path, you're taking a stand as the person who needs to get somewhere to be the self. In the direct path, you're standing as the self and you're looking at all the limitations that are arising, that are obscuring that taking a stand as a self permanently. Okay, so that is the fundamental difference between the two paths. So the how do we go about this? So the progressive path kind of practices that we're going to do on this journey, they are deep contemplations. And in order for these kinds of practices to transform ourselves, we need to have a context of ongoing cultivation of inner silence. Because if our minds are noisy, and if we don't have that background of inner silence, then these contemplative practices don't have the same impact. Only in relation to inner silence do they become transformational. So a daily committed practice of meditation is extremely useful and recommended in order for these deep contemplations to make sense. So meditation helps us cultivate what is known as higher reasoning. And this is the other advantage of a daily committed meditation practice. So in the direct path, higher reasoning is the ability to discern between awareness, taking a stand as awareness or the self or this transcendent reality, and the objects that arise in awareness. So in order for that to happen, that takes discernment, and that's called higher reasoning. And that too is facilitated by a daily committed meditation practice. But there is another practice that helps us cultivate this higher reasoning, and it's called the heart opener. And I love this practice, and you probably have seen it in the book Shakti Rising as well. It is a practice that comes from my teacher, Greg Good, who is this amazing teacher of the direct path. And it really has the ability to open the heart and cultivate sweetness and love, which are essential qualities for making progress on this path. So let's try this for a few minutes, okay? So wherever you are, if your posture has shifted, just go back to adjusting your posture. And just sit comfortably. Make sure your spine is erect. Close your eyes gently. Now take a deep breath, slowly. Then exhale slowly all the way. Take another deep breath. And just go back to the way you would normally breathe. Now, keeping your eyes closed, just notice everything that's going on around you. There may be sounds, not just the sound of my voice, but maybe other sounds in your environment. There might be some sensations. Maybe your limbs feel a certain way for sitting this long. You might be having certain feelings and emotions, certain thoughts. Notice all this. And now, notice that you, as in the awareness, the one that knows all this, are always here. Sounds come and go, sensations come and go, feelings and thoughts come and go. But that knowing awareness is always present. Notice that you are actually this clarity. You are present whether these objects, the sounds, the sensations, and the thoughts, whether all these objects are arising or not, you as this clarity are always here. If there are things arising, you are that which knows the presence of these objects. And if there are no objects, you are that which knows the absence of these objects. Whether there are objects or not, you are always here. Very carefully notice that you are not actually an observed object. You're actually the open spaciousness in which all objects arise. Even what you call your body is just a mass of sensations that arise in this brilliant clarity. Notice that there are no borders to you as this clarity. The room you're in arises in you. So the room is arising in you. The room is in you. You're not in the room. You're not confined. In any way. Now take another deep breath. And wiggle your fingers and your toes. if you feel like it, you can open your eyes. So this is a practice I cannot recommend enough. So as you go about your activities this week, see if you can practice the heart opener for a few minutes here or there. There was a time when I made this my practice at every transition point in my day. So this would be my practice before I ate breakfast. This would be my practice before I ate lunch. I practiced this like day in and day out until it became natural. It's very natural for any new practice to be clunky and to not make sense because it's novel. So try it again and again and get familiar with it. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of writing on when it comes to these kinds of deep contemplations. It's something I can't recommend enough, because when we are inquiring or contemplating into certain things, our minds are so slippery that we might feel prematurely that I got this, or we may go off in tangential ways because that's how our minds work. But when you commit to a writing practice and you journal, you take a question and you just write about it, then you are forced to actually have the mind become single pointed in that activity and really dig deep into what something means for you. So there are many different writing exercises that you can try, many different writing modalities you can try. One that I've been exploring with recently is called proprioceptive writing. And I will put a link for that book in the study area on our course platform. And I'll also describe that method. So in case you're interested, you don't have to buy the book. You can just try the practice for a few times and see if that works for you. There's also another method called morning pages, if you're familiar with that. But the journaling has to happen on a regular basis for this kind of deep contemplations to become very real and open us to transformation. So I would recommend that you get a journal and start writing as we go along, particularly with the homework prompts. Please make it a point to write at least a little bit every week and work with those homework prompts that you will get soon after every class. So it's been a lot of material that we've tried to cover today. And so I'll stop here and see if anybody has any questions. Well, there might be. Let's see if I can get to it.
So if you just hover to the bottom of your Zoom screen,
yeah,
you'll see the chat box.
Yes. Any questions from anyone? So remember that it's okay if you don't have questions right now. You can also ask questions on the platform, on the Ruzuku platform, and I'll answer them there as well. And if you think of something else that comes up during the week, I can also answer it next week. And necessarily this class needed to be longer. So, you know, we will, I can't promise you that, you know, the other classes will be much shorter. It all depends on how the goddess works with all of us in this group. So however she's going to teach is going to be how this is going to unfold. So thank you, Pamela.
One quick mention I wanted to make. Anything related to this course, let's just keep it on Ruzuku or the Shakti Rising Facebook online class page, the event page. We can comment there, but preferably only in Ruzuku, but not on our Shakti Rising group.
Yes.
That's like it's for 100 and I don't know, 100 something people.
Yeah. Yeah, and also it may not make sense to them because they're not part of the course and they may not understand what we are talking about. So, but please use the Ruzuku platform, and it will be private. It's just for us who are in this course, and it's a great way to you know, for us to all connect and to grow together. No questions. Pamela said, beautiful teaching, mantras and meditations. Thank you so much. So much to contemplate. Well, thank you, Pamela. Thank you for being here and for being part of this class. So, Aparna, do you have any other announcements?
No, I just wanted to thank you for this exquisite lesson. It was beautiful, and I'm so inspired and excited to dive into this and participate in the discussions on Ruzuku. And I will now stop the recording.
Yes, thank you. And so you'll get a lesson tomorrow with the homework. So please work with that. And you know, I'm here to answer any questions in the discussion forum. And you know, we will meet again next week, and then this recording will be available to you tomorrow, right, Aparna? Tomorrow. And so please listen to it as many times as you want, because you know, we did cover a lot of stuff, and then, you know, as we move forward, you know, we'll just let it unfold organically. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here and for this wonderful class. And I want to make sure that you see our altar again, and and pay our respects to Shiva and Shakti, who have graced our course so beautifully. And I will see you next week. So, Shri Matre Namaha. Thank you.